Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.
Would you say it could be anticipated that the Chinese would be investors in this project?
Yeah, well, there's a long distance between awarding a tender and the recipient, the company that wins the tender. There's a long distance between them winning the tender and implementing the project. Of course, I can mention ADC and the Anaklia port ourselves as an example of that. If you want to see a much even bigger example than that, you can look, for example, at the Ningskra HPP, which was granted to Korean Water, a Korean state company, years ago, and the government has repeatedly postponed their deadlines for fulfillment of conditions, and has even threatened to break the contract. And I think it's worth noting, for example, that the government tolerated far more delays and deadline extensions from Korean Water at Ningskra than they did from ADC at Anaklia. But the point is that that the fact that they've won doesn't necessarily mean that they will perform. I'd also like to make some comments about the companies that have won the tender, if this is an appropriate moment for me to do that.
Sure, of course.
Yeah,
TI Georgia has just issued a report where they have listed some of the cases, corruption cases from 2009 to 2018, where this company and their daughter companies were also involved in some sort of corruption deals.
Right, and they are under two sets of, that I'm aware of, they're under two separate sets of U.S. sanctions, one that was initiated or is carried out by the Commerce Department of the United States, which prohibits Chinese communications construction company from procuring parts from American suppliers. So that means that no American contractor or supplier can be involved in the Anaklia port project because they would be punished by the U.S. government. The U.S. supplier of goods or services would be. There is also a separate sanction under an executive order that was initially issued by Donald Trump and has been renewed and expanded by President Biden, which prohibits any U.S. person from financing or co-investing with China Communications Construction Company. So that means that no U.S. investor can be in the project. So by picking this company, they have absolutely walled it off from U.S. participation. It is also the practice of EU companies to follow EU sanctions and vice versa. So this is a point I've made, which is that nobody from the West can come into that project as long as CCCC is the main contractor. And I think this was exactly the promise that the Georgian government made to the Russians, was that there would be no Western participation in this project. Therefore, Russia had nothing to fear from an Anaklia port because it's going to be a Chinese project, and China and Russia are allies. But a second point that I haven't seen anybody else mention and that I noticed is that the tender terms, as they were released back in 2023, said that no state companies could participate in the tender. It said that no company with more than 30% state ownership could bid for the project. And Chinese Communications Construction Company is 70% owned by the Chinese government. 30% of its shares are traded. And China Harbors, the junior member of the consortium, is 100% state-owned. And Irakli Kobakhidze brags that these are state companies, Chinese state companies. Well, the tender terms prohibited giving the award to a state company. And the tender terms, if you go to the Ministry of Economy website and you see the documents on this tender, the tender was amended twice to extend deadlines. Again, the government extending deadlines because they didn't have enough interest in this tender. But they have never changed. There is no public information that the government changed this condition, that it not be state companies. So once again, the process is completely non-transparent, so it's ironic that this government is accusing the United States and accusing the EU countries and groups that have been its allies of non-transparency. But of course, non-transparency is the only way they do business. So how does it happen that the tender terms say that a bidder cannot be more than 30% state-owned? And here we have Kobakhidze bragging that they have given the award to 2 Chinese state companies. How does that happen? Did they change the tender terms? There's no public information that they did. So they are violating their own tender terms as far as public information is concerned. If they were to react to this, they might say, oh, here's a piece of paper showing that we made a change and allowed state companies. And my answer to that is, well, why didn't you make it public? Isn't this an issue of public concern?
This transparency that you mentioned, do you think it will be crucial in proceeding with further steps with this Chinese company? And do you see awarding Anaklia port project to the Chinese investors as part of a bigger puzzle, which could be connected with Russian law and offshore law, which we have discussed before?
Yes, absolutely. I believe that the geopolitical environment has changed since February 2022. And what has changed is that Novorossiysk port is essentially closed to, or the traffic that can go through Novorossiysk port on the Russian Black Sea coast has been greatly reduced. And Novorossiysk was really the major gateway to Central Asia for Black Sea trade, because Poti is not big enough or deep enough to take container ships, whereas the Russians had deepened Novorossiysk port, and Novorossiysk is able to take bigger containers. Well, now Novorossiysk, many shipping companies from around the world are not going to go to Novorossiysk because of the sanctions on Russia. And in addition, as you may know, the Ukrainians have successfully sunk at least 2 or 3 ships in Novorossiysk harbor. And so Novorossiysk is now basically off limits. So the Central Asian countries are not able to receive imports or get their exports out with the West. And so the Central Asian countries, and this has been in the news for the last 2 years, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, as well as Azerbaijan, a Caucasus country, our fellow Caucasus country, have been lobbying Georgia and visiting Georgia to try to get the Georgian government to start the Anaklia project so that this bottleneck in their trade can be opened up. Now, I suspect that those 3 countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Azerbaijan, have also been lobbying the Russians and saying, look, back off and let the Georgians do this project, okay? The Russians, from their point of view, have a greater interest in seeing Anaklia operate because, again, their own port, Novorossiysk, is under attack and is sanctioned. So Anaklia can become a bypass for Russia for imports and exports, as long as Georgia doesn't comply with the sanctions against Russia, which it generally, it has complied with some of them, it has not complied with others. But the direction that the Georgian government is going indicates that they're not going to be too worried about Western sanctions on Russia. So I believe that passing the foreign agents law, the offshore law, the turn against the West, the violent rhetoric of the Georgian government against the West, the selection of these sanctioned Chinese companies, it's all an assurance to Russia that Anaklia can be built, and it will only be focused on Russia, Central Asia, maybe Iran as well. I mean, you can note that the prime minister, and I don't remember but the prime minister and another minister attended the funeral of the Iranian president and made a big show of Georgian relations with Iran. And Iran, if you ignore the sanctions, Iran is also within the trade zone for an Anaklia port. And is also, of course, an ally of Russia.
Yeah. Do you see at least like trade-offs in the economic light for Georgia? Do you think Georgia could gain significantly economically from this deal, from betting that there is a bottleneck and that China also might be an interested investor, so to say, in building this port?
Yeah, you know what I would say is the ADC planned project with Western investment is like a Mercedes-Benz, and the Chinese version is like a Zhiguli, okay? That's the difference in the economic effect and the project. The ADC project had 4 international development banks as financiers: EBRD, Asian Development Bank, Asian Industrial Development Bank, and the U.S. Overseas Development Corporation, former OPIC. It had a $50 million loan guarantee from the European Union itself. It had Dutch, Bulgarian, American, Georgian investors. Port operator, Seattle, and construction company, French, Seattle, SSA Marine of Seattle to be the port operator, plus a plan for a 400 hectare special enterprise zone adjoining it. We own that property. ADC owns that property. The Georgian government doesn't own that property. So actually, the Anaklia port project that the Georgian government is planning with the Chinese has no special enterprise zone connected to it, whereas ours did. The upshot of it is, so Western investment, Western financial institutions, you're talking about transparency, you're talking about rules on local content and local employment. You're talking about the special enterprise zone and all the employment that produces. The Chinese investment, China has, and I can send you numerous articles about this company in particular, they have a long history of bringing their own workforce, not employing local people. So they bring not only the managers are foreigners, are Chinese, but as well as the workers are. You can see this on the road construction projects in Georgia, by the way, that they bring in their own workers. They employ very few Georgians. They will not have a special enterprise zone. They will be cut off by U.S. sanctions. So while there will be some economic benefit to Georgia of this port, if it's built by the Chinese, of course, that's true. There'll be some economic benefit to Georgia if it's built by the Chinese, but it will be only a tiny fraction of what that economic benefit could be if it was if the port was tendered and operated according to the rules that we won the tender on. So I'm not even saying, that, it's only ADC that would make a Western project at Anaklia. The previous tender and its terms, had the Georgian government been more willing to make the project more commercially attractive, they would have had big Western operators as bidders, and for the Anaklia port before. So the whole previous framework of this project that the Georgian Dream did themselves, the whole previous framework of this project from 2014 to approximately 2018 was an entirely Western-oriented, transparent economic development project. And then Bidzina got his instructions from Russia. He got his jealousy of Mamuka Khazaradze or whatever his problem was, and he killed the Anaklia project. And now we have what will be a corrupt and extremely limited development under sanctioned Chinese companies. And also, again, by the way, they're violating their own tender terms by having state companies instead of private investors.
Mr. Jonas, you mentioned and you raised several points that I want to dig a little bit deeper. The first thing is about the commercial viability of the project. Do you think it is more commercially viable today?
It is more. So first of all, I want to emphasize that both ADC and the government did several feasibility studies before the war broke out, before the war escalated in Ukraine in February 2022, that showed that it's commercially viable. And by the way, the business case for Anaklia was not even based on China trade. It was based on Caucasus and Central Asia, as well as legal trade that could go in and out of Russia, which of course there is legal trade that can go in and out of Russia, and it still does. So the business case for Anaklia never depended on Chinese trade. If there was Chinese, but China is very far, and the connections from Central Asia into China are not necessary, although you can see they're close on the map, the infrastructure connections are not that good. So there's not that much trade that goes in and out of China through the Western route. There's a lot of Central Asian trade and Caucasus trade, as well as Russian trade, that goes in and out of the Western route. So what was the question?
Yes. So would you say
what I'm saying is about the business case. Sorry, about the business case. So what happened? So anyway, even before the Ukraine war, the business case was solid. The government knew that, and we knew that. After the outbreak of the war in 2022, that's what I'm saying is the business case has only increased. I mean, where there has been really active lobbying from Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan to get this port built. Of course, the alternative, and it's not a good alternative, is the expansion of Poti port. But they just want to see something happen that will increase Georgia's Black Sea trade capacity. And I should mention one other thing. The Georgian government has constantly criticized us, saying that we were stupid to do the Anaklia project because Poti port, an expansion of Poti port by AP Mahler terminals always remained a possibility that would undermine the sustainability of the Anaklia port. If there was another deepwater port on Georgia's coast, Poti, which is not now deep water, but has to be expanded, and Poti requires almost as big of an investment, actually as big an investment as Anaklia to become a deep water port. And they always said that, oh, you guys were so foolish to take our offer of building Anaklia port because we could never promise that Poti port would remain limited and wouldn't be a competitor. Well, here the Georgian government, it shows what hypocrites they are. The Georgian government is now planning Anaklia port. What about Poti? Is AP Mahler Terminals going to expand Poti or not? If AP Mahler Terminals continues to threaten that it's going to expand Poti, you don't get commercial investors, and there's not enough of a market for Anaklia. So the government has not solved this problem of whether Poti is going to be a competitor to Anaklia or not. And AP Mahler Terminals is a private company that seeks to protect its own profit. They do not look out for Georgia's interests. AP Mahler Terminals, for years, every time anything happens on Anaklia, they threaten an expansion of Poti port, which they then do not carry out. But the reason that they threaten these expansions, or they promise these expansions of Poti port, is to derail and sideline anything happening on Anaklia. And the Georgian government has still not solved that problem. It requires an agreement with AP Mahler Terminals to divide the market, basically, between Poti and Anaklia. For example, that Poti would handle, they can do an expansion at Poti, but it will handle bulk freight, and Anaklia will focus on containers, for example. That's a way that the two of them can coexist. And honestly, when we had settlement discussions with the Georgian government, Natia Turneva said that that was exactly a rational plan. But unfortunately, the government ordered her to stop those settlement discussions with us in 2021.
There is this question, or I don't know, this phrase that I hear about the American investors in Anaklia. The Chinese might be even more effective building this because they have a certain interest, while the Americans didn't have that interest to build Anaklia port here in Georgia. Americans could have built the port if they wanted to. This is what I hear from time to time. What would be your response to that?
There's some truth in that, in the sense that the European interest in Anaklia port is far stronger than the American interest in Anaklia port. And so the European participation in ADC was much bigger, really, than the American participation. The American participation in Anaklia was Conti as an investor, which invested a few $1 million. I'm not sure I am at liberty to disclose the exact amount, but they invested a few $1 million, Conti, the American company. And by the way, Conti still has shares in Anaklia, although Conti said that it was going to withdraw from Anaklia. In 2019, after there was so much trouble with the government, Conti said, this doesn't look like it's going to work, and they withdrew. They said they were withdrawing, but in fact, they've never sold their shares. They've never allowed us to buy their shares. So, in fact, Conti is still, the American company is still a shareholder in ADC. There was also SSA Marine of Seattle was going to be the port operator, and SSA Marine committed to invest $18 million, as well as getting a share, and as well as having a major port contract. And also you had the U.S. Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC, which is now ODA. putting up 1/4, it would have been $100 million of the financing. So you did have substantial American presence in the consortium. However, the EBRD was the main European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, was the lead lender of the four lenders. The European Union wanted to see this project built, that when the bank said, well, we're a little bit worried about whether there's going to be enough traffic, we need a loan repayment guarantee, the European Union said, we will put up at least 50 million of that money ourselves, which was an extraordinary offer. And it required the Georgian government to match it, which the Georgian government refused to do. And that's a sign of the Georgian government's, another example where the Georgian government has thrown away an opportunity on purpose to avoid European integration. So the European interest in Anaklia port is absolutely as strong as the Chinese interest. I mean, the European interest is simply the western end of the middle corridor, and the Chinese interest is the eastern end of the middle corridor. But Europe is equally interested in this project. America is more interested in it unquestionably for strategic reasons and political reasons. American trade is much further away from the Black Sea than European trade. And I think you know this, Elene, from watching business in Georgia for many years, that European investment, European economic and financial involvement in Georgia is substantially greater than American private sector involvement. Although the American government puts up as much aid and as much support for Georgia as the EU does.
So you mentioned the Special Enterprise Zone, which is owned by ADC. Do you think there can be any kind of deal between ADC and Georgian government?
Badri Japanidze and Mamuka Khazaradze have always worn two hats. Okay, one is that they're business people and they can look at an attractive deal. But the other is that they see a responsibility to Georgia's Western orientation, and they behaved that way ever since I've known them in the 1990s in their businesses. And so, you know, they own the Special Enterprise Zone. They could make a lot of money by selling it to the Chinese, perhaps. Or you take, if we win the arbitration case, and as you know, I think all the arbitration proceedings are finished and we're waiting for the decision. I can't say whether we're going to win or not. Okay, it's a very difficult case for both sides. So I can't, and the reason it has taken a long time is because it's a very difficult and complicated case, as the arbitrators have made clear. But if we were to win that case, we've always said that we don't really want cash from the Georgian government. We don't want to take money from Georgian taxpayers. What we want is a share in the project. If the project is now a Chinese state-controlled consortium that is set up to smuggle goods and services into and out of Russia and Iran, and you know it's a completely non-Western project, you know, I don't see Mamuka and Badri wanting to have a share in a project with sanctioned Chinese companies. And I can't speak for them, but I don't see them wanting to do that. And I don't see them wanting to sell the free enterprise zone to that consortium, although they would stand to make a lot of money if they did.
Also, do you see this as kind of like an indication of the course that Georgia is not drawing away politically from the West, but it tries to find ways to substitute West in the economic relations as well?
The Georgian Dream is turning the whole Georgian economy upside down. They are literally turning the entire Georgian economy upside down. All of the road infrastructure, the vast majority of the energy infrastructure of Georgia, social welfare programs, education programs have all come from the West. And you know, I noticed at the hearing yesterday, at the hearing in the U.S. Congress yesterday, there were 3 excellent witnesses, but they're all sort of national security focused. So when one of the members of Congress said, you know, what's going to be the effect of losing Western support, they mentioned military, which is very important because the West has absolutely financed the buildup of Georgia's military. And they mentioned sort of civil society, but hello, that's not the biggest stuff. The biggest stuff is roads and energy infrastructure, schools, Okay, the U.S. and the West have paid for the vast majority. The United States, the West, the international development banks based in the West have paid for the majority of Georgia's infrastructure development, including under Saakashvili. Okay, this needs to be recognized. The Saakashvili government gets credit for building Georgia. They built it on IFI money, Western money that came from the outside into Georgia. So the country's entire standard of living, such as it is, has been based on Western infrastructure investment and money. You won't see anything like that from the Chinese, and you certainly won't see it from the Russians. The Chinese do not support the general social welfare or infrastructure of the countries in which they invest. Nor do the Chinese don't do it because they don't want to, and the Russians don't do it because they don't have the money, even if they did want to. And you can, and I can send you links about the behavior of Chinese companies in Africa, in the Balkans, everywhere where they've been allowed to invest. You get non-transparency. You get employment of imported Chinese labor, not local people. They don't do anything for the surrounding society or its infrastructure, and they pay lots of bribes. So they're associated with corruption. So that's what you're going to get. So this course that the Georgian government is taking is an economic catastrophe for Georgia. Number one, because of the cutoff of Western assistance means that all of these ongoing infrastructure and other projects are going to be stopped. And then secondly, the Chinese and the Russians simply cannot and will not replace that spending.
You know, this phrase, follow the money. If we follow the money for an Anaklia port project, where will Georgian government bring money to invest in an Anaklia port project? What do you know specifically, if you know anything, about the debt trap that is associated with China and Chinese state companies?
That's a really good question, Elene, because this tender was set up, and we commented on it. I did a lot of news interviews on it more than a year ago. This tender was set up for the state to have 51% ownership and the investor to have 49%. So the Georgian government has a 51% ownership under this new tender structure, and these Chinese state companies have a 49% interest. A 51% state interest means that just for the first phase of the Anaklia project, which costs $600 million, that's the investment amount. And by the way, it's probably only increased because that 600 million number was assuming that the port would come online in 2020. So it's got to be more than that now. Let's say 700 million. That means, as the 51% shareholder, let's use the 600 million number because that's where I've worked out the math. With a 600, if the investment is 600 million and the Georgian government has a 51% stake, they have to come up with $310 million of cash and real assets, the Georgian government, to put into this project. Where is that $310 million? It doesn't exist. It's not in the partnership fund, which is the only kind of commercial pot of money that the Georgian government has. And you wonder, are they thinking about using the pension fund? There goes the pension for the Georgian people.
Do you think land and railway and roads, like what is also incorporated into these tender companies, would that make up those $310 million?
No, the land is given without, the land is allocated without cost. That is the nature of the project. And it wouldn't add up to that amount of money anyway. The big demand that many investors have had on the Georgian government in the past, which the Georgian government refused to do, was to build the breakwater, which is a big piece of infrastructure and I think costs in the neighborhood of $200 or $250 million. And it's really genuinely a piece of state infrastructure. Okay, it's part of the harbor itself, which is under the Constitution of Georgia assigned to the harbors. The offshore waters are under the government's inalienable ownership. It cannot be privatized. So in the past, during the first tender, for example, Singapore Ports and some of the other companies that participated in the tender in 2015, 2016, they had a consistent demand that the Georgian government put up about $200 or $250 million to build the breakwater. which the Georgian government consistently refused to do. That's why Anaklia Development Consortium was, at the end of the day, the only company that was willing to take all of this on and take all of the risks to do that project. Where is the Georgian government going to come up with $310 million today? They don't have it. And exactly as you said, if they don't have it, what are they going to do? They might borrow it from their Chinese partner. They might borrow it from the Chinese companies and then end up in debt to them, unable to pay the debts, and end up losing ownership of the project entirely.
Mr. Jonas, thank you for your time so much. And my last question, would that also help raising doubts about Georgia avoiding international sanctions? Because we see that international sanctions are not, unfortunately, won't be going that fast away looking at Russia-Ukraine war. So would you say that Chinese investments, offshore law, non-transparency into the project could add up to the doubts that were naturally rising about Georgia from time to time, although there is no evidence and no one has ever said that Georgia has circumvented this international sanctions because it is a neighbor of Russia and we have the joint border.
I think that Georgia ceasing to comply with Western sanctions against Russia is part of this project. I think that part of the business plan of the new tender conditions and the Chinese investment, that literally part of the business plan of that is that they will not follow the sanctions against Russia.
The Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.